We're up to part two of our interview with Stuart Epps, who's worked with Led Zeppelin, Elton John, The Firm, Paul Rogers, Twisted Sister, Robbie Williams, and a whole bunch of other people. And keep in mind, Stuart is taking new clients. If you want to be produced by a guy who's worked with all those heavyweights, go to stuartepps.co.uk. The link will also be in our description. Part two of our interview with Stuart Epps on Rock History Book. Why did you stop working with Elton in the first era? What happened?
Well, the first era, I just turned 71 years of age at the weekend, and I was looking back, and it was actually 53 years ago that I met Elton on the same day, April the 2nd, to start a 3-month tour with him in America. But that's when I was 19 years old. So there's this whole time when I never worked for Elton. At that time, I was working for Dick James. Then I was working for Rocket Records, which, he was involved in, but I wasn't strictly working for him. And, I wasn't really working with his team, as it were, on the road. We just did that tour. Then in 74, I did a tour with Kiki D, and that was still when I was at Rocket, and Elton was the headline and she was supporting. Then when Gus Dudgeon started the Mill Studios, I was working for Gus. So Gus was still Elton's producer. So I was still involved with Elton through Gus. And then we did Ice on Fire, and we did all sorts of things. And then, so it would just be, I was never working for him. So just now and again, I would get involved. We did the duets. That wasn't the last time I saw him by any means, but we did the duets album, which Chris Rea sang on, and I was involved in that. I actually got him on a project. It's not often probably he does projects for other people, but Frankie Miller, I don't know if you've heard of Frankie Miller. He's an amazing singer who's been very ill. He sort of got all sorts of problems and couldn't sing. But he wanted to do this album of getting together with artists, but he couldn't sing, so he wanted them to do duets, if you like, with his old recordings, and everyone was saying, well, forget it, Elton will never do that. But I just thought, well, I'll write to him anyway. And he said, Carl, yeah, I'll do it, thanks for asking me. So he did one of Frankie's songs. And I'll go to the gigs when he's in England and this sort of thing, but as far as working together, I haven't actually worked with him for quite some time. Absolutely, yeah. I engineered Single Man. Definitely, yeah. That was the first album that he did at the Mill, and that was actually my mate Clive Franks was producing that and playing bass on it. And
I find that's a very underrated record. I love that record.
Well, yeah, I haven't, apart from Song for Guy, which I tend to hear. It's probably played on the radio somewhere in the world right now. It's such a popular track. And I've got a crazy story that goes with that when we were recording that, which I've recounted many times. I could recount it again. But
yes, please.
Song for Guy, like I say, is, like we know, has become a classic. And so I'll tell you the story, which is a bit mad, because we were recording Single Man, and Clive was producing, I was engineering at the Mill, and everything was going well. But on this particular day, Elton came in, and at some point through the day, he said, look, I've just got this idea of a track I want to put down I don't know if he said song or instrumental, but he said, I want to put something down before I go home tonight. It's in my head. So, we said, all right, fine. Anyway, it got pretty late. For us, it was 10 o'clock or something, 11 o'clock. Everyone's gone home or going home. And Elton suddenly says, oh, I've forgotten. I want to put this thing down. He says, it'll only take a minute, only take a minute. Always beware of that phrase, only take a minute. So anyway, there's Clive and me and Elton. There's only the three of us in the whole building. So I put some tape on. I thought, well, I'll put some multi-track on, because who knows? It's Elton John. It might be something important. You never know. Anyway, I put a bit of multi-track on. He goes out there, starts playing this thing, and it's obviously an instrumental. He's not singing. I might have set up a vocal mic, but it's da 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 da. Anyway, he only gets a little way and then he makes a mistake. Anyway, not to worry, not to worry. I look down at the machine, I wind it back, and off we go again. Da, 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 da. He makes another mistake. Well, he kept making mistakes, and now he's getting a bit annoyed with himself because he said it would only be a minute, you know, and he's starting to get a bit annoyed and because it's a bit tricky chord wise, I guess. Anyway, so it's now taking quite a lot of time. He's getting a bit act off, but on this particular take, he's going away and he's roaring away, and he hasn't made a mistake for ages. And I look down at the tape machine, and I think, well, you know, it wasn't a full reel. It was only part of a reel, and we're going at 30 inches per second here, so it's roaring away. But you know, how long can this thing be? It can't be that long. I thought 3 minutes. You know. Anyway, it's not looking great because he doesn't have. It doesn't seem any signs of him stopping. It's just going da 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 da. And now I look down at the tape machine, and blow me down, there's not a ton left. So now we're thinking of the scenario that I run out of tape, he hasn't finished the song, and it's the first time in its whole existence that he's played it through without a mistake. What is likely to happen there is we could be killed, he'll go totally bananas, he'll smash the place up. So now I'm really looking at the machine, trying to gauge how much is left, looking at Elton to asking Clive, does he look like he's going to stop? Do you reckon that, you know, we're like 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes, I don't know. Anyway, the two of us are now sweating all over the place. I'm looking at the machine, and I don't know if you've ever worked 24 track, but you almost can't see how much tape is left. You know, it's like running on empty. You know, it's like when your fuel gauge is going. And we're just going mad because it's unthinkable that I'm going to run out of tape for the very first time. Anyway, it's not any word of a lie. He finishes the last chord, and as the last chord dies away, the tape runs out. The tape runs out, and we run out. We fall on the floor in exhaustion, or you know, this pain suddenly leaves us that we managed to get this piano track down on this bit of tape, and that's how it started. And you know, that was the master tape of the first piano track that went on tape, and that instrumental just built into this pretty good instrumental. You know, I mean, a pretty good, whatever you'd call it. You know, he doesn't write many instrumentals, but
he's mumbling. Isn't he mumbling along at near the end of it?
But he's not. No, for some reason. Well, it's not for some reason. He wrote it because he wrote it for a person called Guy. Okay. Now, there's some ridiculous things that go along with this record, because at the same time, there was a gorilla that died at London Zoo, and his name was Guy. He was Guy the gorilla, which everyone knew about in the UK. So we thought that he wrote it for Guy the gorilla who died, but it wasn't Guy the gorilla. It was actually a young boy called Guy who had died on his motorbike, who worked for Rocket Records. And so Elton was writing it for him and put it in his honor. And at some point he wanted it to say, life isn't everything. That's where he just wanted to say that in the somewhere instrumental, life isn't everything, which we thought was a bit weird. But so actually we thought, well, that's just going to sound weird if it's just him going, life isn't everything. So we tried all sorts of effects and tried it backwards, but anyway, in the end, that's what he's saying, life isn't everything. And well, it was one of those moments really that I've had quite a few of in my career, where someone starts something off in the studio that seems pretty nothingy, you don't know, and it goes on. And that's definitely one of them, because we're talking about, I don't know how many years, that's 40 years or something ago. And like I say, they'll still play it on the radio. In fact, I was at this club, only a beautiful club just up the road, and someone's come out of dinner. He's obviously a bit piddled, and there's a piano there and he starts playing Elton John, Your Song, which I thought, well, that's not bad. Well, when he launches into Song for Guy, and I just had to go up to him and I said, come on now, you've done it now, because he's over the river and I've got to tell him the history of it. I didn't tell him this story because I think he was trying to impress his girlfriend, actually. But yeah, Song for Guy.
It was such a different stage for him. I mean, the thing is, I remember, and all of the Elton John, I was an Elton John fanatic at that point, and I was 18 years old, and I remember wanting to love the album just because I was rooting for him, because you get homers. We call them homers in North America. Some people do, where that no matter what the artist puts out, no matter what it is, you're going to love it. Yeah. Nigel's your favorite drummer. Dee's your favorite bass player. Davey's your favorite guitarist, because they're in that band and they mean a lot to you. Not because they're technically the best, but they're certainly the best. That was something else that they had there. But that album, I remember first listen, I didn't like it. I thought it sounds different. I remember thinking it needs more bottom end. I'm very critical. And my other friends saying, "Are you kidding? This is like the best sounding Elton John record." And I remember it being for years one of my favorite Elton John records. It just ended up being, to me, it was refreshing, that album. It was stripped down in some ways. From your point of view, though, he had gone through this and he was kind of like, he had gone up here and no one knew where he was going. What was the experience like? What was the Elton like that you worked with?
Well, we had a good time. We had a lot of fun. He was pretty mad during that album. I mean, he was doing a few, he was actually, if I'm remembering rightly, because I only did 2 at the Mill. There's that one and Ice on Fire. I think he was, do you know what? I can't remember what he was doing. I think, I can't remember. But the thing is, the main difference was he wasn't writing with Bernie. They're not Bernie songs.
Yeah.
So he was writing with Gary Osborne, who's a lovely guy who wrote Blue Eyes and all that. And you see, I suppose that's the big difference, and I often talk about that, is that you can't imagine, well, you can imagine, and actually someone said, what do you think Elton would have been like without Bernie? Well, you could say single man, because, when Bernie sends Elton a lyric, that dictates the type of song completely, really. And one way or another, that's the genius of that partnership, is that Bernie's, and it happened obviously from the very first Elton John album, not the first Elton album, but the album called Elton John with Your Song. That's what changed the songs, and the direction and all sorts was Bernie's lyrics. And they obviously set something off in Elton's mind to make him write in that way. And I guess, you see, he'll admit this himself. He doesn't wake up in the morning and write a song. He only writes a song to order. When he's given a lyric, or the record company, which he's not with anymore, says we need an album, he doesn't write songs for fun. He writes songs as a job. He's a jobbing songwriter. So I think I don't even know what was behind singing. Well, it was Clive that was producing, so he didn't have Gus. He probably just thought, I want to make an album. Him and Gary had got together. He wanted to have some fun. I mean, there was also no one on that album telling him anything. Gus was pretty dynamic. When Gus was producing, he would tell him if he thought a song was shit, if he thought it was great, if he thought it should be edited. There was no one telling him anything. I remember there was a song for that album called Hello Campers, which I don't think made it on there, but it's the sort of thing that he'd come up with, because he is crackers. He's mad, and he's likely, and he can write anything. He can write anything. I mean, actually, you're reminding me, because one of the best things on that album was Paul Buckmaster, who I've got stories about that, and he's not with us anymore. So it doesn't really, not that they're terrible stories, but Paul Buckmaster was eccentric, totally eccentric, and but there's some beautiful arrangements on that album. And we did the strings at the Mill, and that was they were always special occasions, to do strings. But actually, a little story there, which no one will know, so it's a scoop, is that Clive had been to see Paul months before the recording, and they'd been through every song, and they'd said, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to do. And then it was months that Paul had to work on the album arrangements, right? So he gets, and so the mill is booked for, I don't know, a few days with an orchestra to do the arrangements all planned out. And it's, I can't believe I'm saying this now, but it is true, because Paul turned up and he said, look, I've got a terrible thing to tell you. He said the cat hit some ink and it went all over the arrangements. I haven't got any arrangements at all. He said they were completely destroyed, he said. So, and Clive's saying, obviously, yeah, that's funny, that's a joke. And he said, well, it's not, I'm afraid. I haven't got anything at all. So I'll have to write them again. I'll have to write them all again. And it wasn't a joke. And I mean, I think the cat thing was, yeah, that was, I don't think that was true, to be honest. But
the dog ate my homework. The dog ate my homework.
We're gonna know now. Anyway, what I do know is that unfortunately he was into cocaine, and so a lot of cocaine had to be ordered, and him and Clive stayed up all that night writing the arrangements for the next day for the orchestra that then appeared, and then they'd be up that night writing, you know. So, but he was a pure he's a genius, Paul Buckmaster.
Oh yeah,
you know, his arrangements were just, you know. So I'll have to listen to that. I'll have to listen to that album again, but I haven't listened to it for a long time.
You worked with Nigel as a solo artist, right?
I did do something on his first solo album, and then actually he came to the mill to do orchestra on one of his solo albums as well. Yeah, Nigel's a great artist as well, you know, and I mean, he probably hasn't done as much as, you know, he could have done, because I mean, the thing with Nigel was that he was in the original band, of course, and I was on those first tours when it was just a three-piece. That tour in 1971 was without guitar, you know, it was just a three-piece, and they were an amazing band, and Nigel was a very specific drummer, really. He was very specifically a rock drummer, although he was great at the ballads as well. He was not like an intricate jazz drummer.
It wasn't like Roger. Roger filled everything.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is that there wasn't a rivalry. Well, there wasn't one in Nigel's. You know, they both had a good go at it, and unfortunately, Roger kind of lost the plot a little bit, mentally and in all sorts of ways. But with Gus, you see, Gus would use Nigel or Roger when it very specifically on the tracks, on the songs that he thought they suited, and you know, and he did that brilliantly, really, because between the two of them, because Roger wouldn't do a straight rock beat, really, whereas Nigel's perfectly happy just sitting there rocking away, you know, with his hair roaring, whereas, you know, Popey, as we used to call him, was much more intricate. But between the two of them, you know, they covered everything. So there was the period when it was the three-piece, and then, you know, then Nigel was given the sack, really, I suppose. I mean, it was devastating for him and Dee.
And the fans.
I mean, can't imagine that phone call coming, you know. Well, I don't know. I think he did call them personally, you know, and say, I fancy I fancy a change. Can you get another job for a while? You know, what bloody blow. So, you know, so they had to sort of go off and do other things, which they did. And because Davey stayed, but then, you know, well, unfortunately, Dee died, of course, as we know. But then Nigel got another go at it, and he's been there for forever. You know, I mean, I often sort of wonder what they're saving up for, but because they must have enough by now. But anyway, I don't think it's ever going to come to an end. And I just read today that Elton's put in 100 more gigs or something on the end of his retirement tour.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
I don't think there's ever going to be a retirement, but it obviously is a good selling thing if you tell your fans this is the last time you're going to see me.
Well, I asked Davey when I talked to him last year. He says, "Well, it'll look different." He says, "If it probably won't. I don't know about ending, but it'll look different where it won't be a major." This is what the line that they give. Nigel's the king of less is more. He didn't try to. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm more of a Roger type of drummer. I like that very personally, but for Elton, Nigel really, he was perfect. Like that Phil on "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me" is like, to this day, I look at it, I'm going, God, that's not a lot, but it's so perfect. Just
the thing is that Elton is doing those songs now, so they have had other drummers, but how can you better the guy that played on the original and who played so brilliantly? That's the thing. So they've had other drummers. There was a drummer there that Elton, I think he was in McCartney's band. I can't remember his name, but
and there was Charlie Morgan as well.
Yeah, well, you see, what happened there was, that's not a bad story. You've reminded me, because when we did Ice on Fire, I can't think why, but there wasn't a drummer in the band. I can't think how that could have been, but there wasn't one. So on Ice on Fire, we had lots of drummers, because actually he used lots of different musicians. So we had Charlie Morgan, we had Dave Mattox, we had the drummer from Simple Minds, and we had the drummer from Queen. Believe it or
Roger.
Not. Yeah, they're all on that Ice on Fire album. So there was like a vying for who was going to be the drummer in the band, and I think we all thought it'd probably be Dave Mattox, because I think I just imagined that his drumming, if you haven't got Popey, if you haven't got Nigel for some reason, Dave Mattox for me has always been like amazing drummer. I mean, he's worse than less is more. He's like nothing at all, but his feel is incredible. And if you push him, he might do a fill somewhere or other. If you pay him a bit more, I think that's what it is. Because I've talked to him about that. He was so fed up with coming in, sitting there, doing what he thought, because let's face it, Fairport Convention, the drumming on that was out of this world. He was all over the place. So when he started doing sessions and he's doing all that, and then they're going, well, can you miss that one out and don't do the fill there? And then he's realized all they want is effing bass drum and snare and hi-hat. So I'll do that. And if they want a fill, I'll put it in as an extra. Or what used to happen with Mattox is he'd start doing fills on the fade. When it got to the end, the last chorus, he'd start doing all these fills. And Gus would say, what you're doing at the end there? You couldn't put it in after couldn't bring it in a bit earlier, could you? And all this. But I love Dave Mattox. Do you know his stuff at all?
Yes. Yeah, well, my son's a much better drummer than I am, and he follows all. He's always telling me about drummers, left, right, and center.
So the other story is that you'll like this story, because this is all. No one else knows this, or very few. So the other thing is that there's this guy comes in, Charlie Morgan, right? I don't know where he came from. I guess Gus must have known. I don't know where he came from. Anyway, at one point he comes up to me. He says, "Everyone keeps asking about my dad." And he said, "Why are they doing that?" And he said, "Well, it's Barry Morgan, isn't it?" And he said, "No." We just assumed because his name's Morgan and he's a drummer, his dad must have been Barry Morgan, who was this phenomenal session guy I said, "Oh." He said, no, my dad's called Jim or something. I don't know. But the thing is that, yeah, admittedly, Charlie Morgan, great drummer, but he was also a great talker. And he talked himself into the band, to be honest, because he's very affable anyway. And
I've talked to him. I've interviewed him twice.
Ah, there you go. Yeah. So him and Elton, just because Elton's, he's the personality he is. And Charlie just, they just got on. So when it came to the next tour, it was like, who's the drummer? Charlie Morgan. But he was in that band for about 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, it was only this that got him out of it, I think, because he used to talk maybe a little bit too much for a drummer.
I know
Drummers aren't supposed to, they're not supposed to talk, you know.
I know we worked with Kate Bush and Nick Kershaw. We talked about that. Wishbone Ash, a band that wasn't that well known. They weren't like a Deep Purple or something. That's a band that I always thought would become bigger in North America. But you worked with them, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, at the Mill during the Jimmy Page era, I don't know. I think I did know their manager. I think it was John Sherry, thinking about it, and they'd already done quite a lot of work on it. And I didn't really know much about them at all. Okay. I can't think. I never even heard them, or might have heard them and didn't know who it was. And they came in with all this material, and they were straight away great guys. Straight away. I mean, they also had the two members that I really remember is the bass player, who's Trevor Bolder, who wasn't in an original lineup, but Trevor Bolder was this guy with this hair down here, and he wasn't exactly a youngster, but he was an extremely nice guy. I mean, he was in the Spiders of Mars with, I didn't know this, but he was in David Bowie's band, and you know, but he's such a nice guy. And also the guitarist on that album, Laurie Wisefield, he wasn't in the original lineup either, and he played with Tina Turner. I can't remember his name, but anyway, he was equally brilliant guy, an amazing guitarist. And the album we did was called Twin Barrels Burning, and I loved it. I more or less just mixed it all, to be honest, but he was just a amazing guitarist, and we had a ball anyway. So I always and I did know the manager from years before, and yeah, we had a great time.
I was just reading about Dee Snider talking about, what is it called, Widowmaker, this band that he says everything we tried to do after Twisted Sister, and he said for whatever reason my fame had run out, and so tell me about working with him.
Oh, yeah. No, it's not really oh dear at all, actually, because how that happened was, you know, in the Jimmy Page era, Phil Carson, who was running Atlantic Records, very nice guy, great guy, really. He brought me Vandenberg as well, you know, this Dutch band Vandenberg, and you know, we had great success with them, and they were a brilliant band, you know, no doubt about it. And then one day there was a ringing at the doorbell at the Mill. So, and I'm on my own. I go to answer the door, and there's these guys standing there with hair all over the place and teeth and just, you know, American yapping away. And they're just jumping up and down. Oh, we're Twisted Sister or something or other with this, that, and the other. We've come to see you, Phil Carson. There's Phil Carson. I said, well, come in. You know, I just opened the door. They just charged in, all these long-haired loonies, and they're running all over the place. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, you're producing, Phil Carson said you're producing our next album. I said, oh, did he really? That's nice of him. And anyway, they're like touching stuff because Jimmy Page might have touched it, and picking up drumsticks because they think John Bonham's been here and all that. They're like the equivalent of Japanese tourists, except they're, you know, rock band material. Anyway, I said, look, I'll tell you what, can you just wait there a minute? I just got to go and make a phone call. So I go down to the phone. I call up Phil Carson. I said, look, there's a load of maniacs here. They say that I'm producing their next album. He said, yeah, that's right. You're doing it. I said, oh, well, thanks for telling me. You know, I don't know anything about them at all. He said, well, it's going to be good. It's going to be great. You're doing it. Sort it out. So I go back into the control room, and I said, well, seems like this is going to happen. I better have a listen to what we're doing. You know, obviously you're a band. So they put on a track from this album that they've been doing called Under the Blade. And I'm pretty sure I thought, this is the worst thing I've ever heard in this room. We would never play anything this crap in this room. It was horrible. And they were saying that it's called heavy metal or something, but I just thought, well, you can call it what you like. I know what I would call it. It's terrible rubbish. I said, anyway, well, you know, it's Phil Carson. He said, I'm doing it. I said, have you got anything else? Because I said, what about, you know, new material? and he had D had a cassette. It was in those days. He said, "This is one track that we're going to do." I put it in, and it starts up, and it's this track called "I Am, I'm Me," and I thought, well, actually, I quite like that. I could imagine it being like My Generation, a bit like a Who track. And the mad thing is, it only got into a minute and then it stopped. I said, well, where's the rest of it? Oh, well, we haven't finished it yet, or something or other. I said, well, I like that, I like that. Anyway, so I guess they went away again, and then when they came back to do the album, it was all booked, and it was a very classic production, really, in terms of how we did it. They came in and we rehearsed. We rehearsed in the studio. We went through all the songs, and we worked out arrangements. I mean, it was to say it's basic is just to is to just forget it. I mean, it was like going back to primary school or something. It was so basic, rock and roll, rock tracks. But the great thing was they're great guys. They're great guys. D, mad looking guy. And I used to take them to Cookham High Street, which is a pretty, very English, sedate sort of place. And I'm walking down the street with this guy who looks like, what's her name? The actress with curly hair. Anyway, crazy people. And sorry about that, it's my alarm. That's but okay. We had a ball, actually. We had the best time. I mean, all this sort of swearing business was pure for the press. They all had pictures of their wives. It turns out D doesn't even drink. He's never had any alcohol. He's like the straightest rock guy you can imagine, and yet their stage set, because I went, what had happened is they'd already done a live gig at the Marquee, and I actually had to mix that. So I heard the live show with all this terrible swearing going on, and but when they were at the Mill, there was no swearing. They were like, good as gold, really, absolutely good as gold. And the thing is that I decided to definitely do "I Am, I'm Me" as a pop single. So we did it very much, the solos, everything in it. We structured it that way, and it was a bloody big hit. And they're on Top of the Pops, and the biggest show in the UK. And I went to Top of the Pops, and I'm in the audience giving it all this stuff, and they're wearing all the makeup, and it was like pure. You hear about artists. I suppose you would say Elton was like that, but actually, yeah, he used to dress up, but then he used to dress up to go down the shops. I mean, he wasn't really dressing up much more than when he was in normals. But whereas Twisted Sister, when they're going to do their bit, it's pure, it's pure Hollywood. It's pure bravado and all the rest of it, with the makeup and the swearing and they're putting on an act. It was an act, and it was a bloody good one because they sold millions of records.
Yeah.
It's not easy. Yes, I did.
Well, it's interesting. You work with Robbie Williams and you work with Jimmy Page, and those two guys, they're all over the press of not like because of they live beside each other and they've had this row.
Well, that's right. Well, it's not just that, and now I'm going to give you another piece of information that no one knows, is that Robbie Williams is managed by a guy called Tim Clark, who I've known for nearly 50 years because he was working at Island Records when when Rocket Records was going, and he's a great guy, a pure gentleman, and he became Robbie's manager and did an amazing job. When I worked with Robbie, he'd had one solo album called Life Through a Lens, and when he came to my studio, Life Through the Lens had sort of pretty much died a death, sold 20,000 copies. It was a failure. And so there's a David Enthoven. There was two managers. It's amazing how I'm remembering things. Tim Clark and David Enthoven are Robbie Williams manager, and Chris, who was running the record company, running EMI, Chris Briggs. It's Chris Briggs who rang me up and said, I've got an artist for your new studio. He's called Robbie Williams. I thought, well, I've heard of him. He was in that band. They were quite big. Take that. Anyway, so they came in, and they came in with all this new material. And it was, you know, Life Through the Lens was doing nothing. So it was very, very important that something happened here, you know. I mean, and in all fairness to the management team and everything else, they were going to stick with him no matter what. And he was going through a lot of drugs and a lot of drink problem and all that. But on meeting Robbie, he's just great guy. You know, funny. He's such a huge Elton fan. You know, and even when we were working, he'd say, what would Elton do here? Or what was it like when you were doing this with Elton? He's such a big fan of Elton's. And at one point he said, I haven't spoken to Elton in ages. I said, look, hang on a minute. And I got him on the phone. I said, here he is.
My God.
Yeah, I mean, they were, you know what? I was trying to get them two together to write. They would have made such an amazing writing team. Because Robbie can't play an instrument. Well, he can play guitar just about, but he's a brilliant lyricist. And so lyrics, Robbie Williams, Elton, music would have been such a great partnership, you know. But I guess in the end they sort of fell out over something, whatever it was. Actually, it's not so much Robbie Williams and Jimmy Page, you said. But the crazy thing is that I worked with Robbie, and he is a bit of a lad, as we know, but he was having an affair with this singer, who I can't remember her name now, but it was only a couple of months later that I was working with Oasis and one of the Gallaghers, what's his name? Liam Gallagher. Liam and Noel, yeah.
No, well, Liam, that's right.
Liam was having an affair with the same girl that Robbie was having an affair with just a few months earlier. And at the time, the two of them hated each other. They were going to have a fight in England. They hated each other so much they were going to put on a boxing match. But they were both bonking, I can say that, the same woman. But anyway, when Robbie came in to talk about Robbie, he came in with this co-writer who you will have to do one of your, because I can never remember his name. And so I'm not going to be remembering it now. But the co-writer was a bit of a musical genius. And the two of them were an amazing partnership that came up with Angels, that came up with this subsequent album called I've Been Expecting You. But they didn't do it all. I didn't record it all. They'd already had quite a lot of it when they came to the studio that I had, Wheeler End. And we did some vocals, we did some backing vocals, we did guitars and keyboards and all sorts. And while he was there, they released Angels from Life Through a Lens, which just took him through the stratosphere, you know. And in fact, I sang with him backing vocals on the B side of it, and then, you know, subsequently, because it was a great album, the one that we did was a great album. It had Millennium on it, because it was a very clever idea to come up with a song Millennium before the Millennium and all that. But it was a brilliant album, and I can't remember who he was writing the songs with, but they were a great team. I mean, Robbie was just, I mean, he was a bit delicate because he was, you know, on drugs or whatever, or trying to come off this, that, and the other. But he was he's a fascinating guy. I got on great. I just thought he was brilliant because he belittles himself. You see, he's this huge star, and he was still pretty big then. But he wasn't full of himself at all. He was the opposite, you know.
Yeah.
And yet when you see him on TV, because he is an act, so when you see him on TV, he's like Mr. Personality. He's James Bond. You know, he's incredible. You know, and the camera loves him to bits. One thing I can say that's also a bit of a scoop is that when we were doing this album, he did a lot of out of tune. He wasn't perfectly in tune. And so what used to happen was, as he left the studio doing vocals, they'd come in with all this sky high equipment to tune his voice, because at that time actually auto-tune was in its infancy really, and it wasn't a little plug-in, it was like 15 pieces of equipment, costing thousands and thousands of pounds. So they'd come in, they'd wait till he was out of the building because they wanted to spare his feelings, you see. So they didn't want to tell him what they were doing, which I understand, because everyone hates, well, a lot of people hate autotune. They're just like, I don't need autotune. Why do I need autotune? I don't need it. So they waited until he was out of the building. Then they tuned his voice, and I think it taught him to sing in tune, actually, because if you keep hearing yourself, and he probably just thought, well, they've twiddled with it somewhere, But it was great working with him, and I'm pleased that we did the album. I didn't work with him again because he more or less moved to America anyway after that, and he's done very well.
I just read a thing on Chris Rea, that the fact that he had said that to, I think, Ultimate Classic Rock, he had said, well, I didn't really play the game. I didn't like playing the game. I'm just one of those guys that doesn't want to. What was your experience like working with him?
Each one of these is like, I could do a book on each one, you see.
Yeah.
I could talk forever. You've picked out the very top ones that I worked a lot with, But Chris Rea, I can do a lot on that. So but he came to Cookham as a kid, really. As a kid, although he was 21 or something. He wasn't a little kid, but he'd got this opportunity to work with Gus, Elton's producer. So it was a big deal. And he was signed to this record company, Magnet Records, and the head of Magnet Records is now Lord Levy. He was Michael Levy then, sort of very typical Jewish, bit like a Dick James, a young Dick James, entrepreneurial, want to find the next Elton John or the next whatever it is. And so this young guy had come to him from up north, a bit, what's the word? I don't know what the word is actually. Anyway, his name's Chris Rea. So Michael liked his songs, was going to put them together with Gus, but obviously, as far as he was concerned, Chris Rea is not going to be his name. I mean, that's just, there's all sorts of Rea connotations, and that's just not a pop star name, is it, Chris Rea? So he comes up with this idea of calling Chris Benny Santini, because he knows that he comes from Italian background, and he was very, very good looking, Chris, with curly blonde hair or whatever. Well, maybe it wasn't curly, don't know where I got that from, but anyway, he looked very handsome and he looked sort of Italian. Benny Santini. You don't know Chris, but you can only imagine what his reply to that was. You're a fucking girl. So, and that's why the first album was called Whatever Happened to Benny Santini.
Yeah.
But he pretty much told Michael Levy where he could stick that name. And in fact, he wrote a song about it, which is on that album. But anyway, as soon as I met Chris, we became great buddies. Because actually, I'd been listening to his demos. Gus would play these demos that were very simplistic demos of Chris pretty much doing everything himself. And I love the songs. I don't remember thinking his voice was amazing, but I liked it a lot. And as soon as I met him, we just got on. We were just got on great straight away. And we started working on the first album at the Mill. And there was a song on it called Bows and Bangles. And as soon as I heard it, I could hear all the harmonies in the chorus. I love to sing harmonies. It's my favorite thing. So when they went home, I stayed behind and I stuck about 100 voices on it. Bows and bangles on your fingers. It sounded better in those days. Anyway, I played it to them in the morning and they loved it. And Chris loved it and Gus loved it. And I'm only 26 or something, 25 or something. So I was over the moon. I ended up doing all the backing vocals on the whole album then. And because Chris actually, although he's singing quite high on it, he didn't have a very high voice, so he couldn't reach them anyway. So making that first album was a pure joy, absolutely brilliant. Then we did Deltics, which actually, I did completely because we had another engineer. The other engineer at the mill is called Phil Dunn, who mixed all the early albums, Elton albums, with Gus. And but he was always getting himself into trouble. So as soon as he was out of the engineer's chair, I was in that chair, working with Gus, who I totally adored and looked up to. I mean, he's like the king. So to sit, although I'd engineered and I'd produced even, Gus is the king of producers. So to sit in the chair next to him and then to actually be engineering stuff that he produced was just, couldn't get better than that, you know.
I remember the day I heard about the accident with he and his wife, and I remember going, oh, I was, yourself as a broadcaster, I end up being selfish sometimes of going, oh, I wanted to talk to Gus Dudgeon, and Paul Buckmaster was the same thing. Oh, I never got a chance to talk to Paul Buckmaster, but he was one of those producers in the 70s where he's like Phil Ramone and where you got to, George Martin, obviously the ultimate example of producers that everyone who knew music would know,
Well, that's another name I can do several hours on, of course, because I knew Gus right from when he first started with Elton, how he got to work with Elton, and then through all those early albums. So that's what I mean. So by the time he built the mill and I went to work for Gus, I was already obviously a massive fan. We were great mates. It wasn't all plain sailing though, because I don't even know where to start. I mean, Elton, Gus, a total perfectionist that could make you want to kill yourself if you happen to be having to work with him, you see. I mean, I've got all sorts of stories, tons of stories. He could spend 2 weeks getting the sound of a creaky door for a track, and getting, well, all right, so we'll home in on drums because you're a drummer, right? So Gus was totally fastidious about every instrument, but drums, because there's so much you can do. So it was not unknown for him to spend days, getting a drum sound. And when we started at the mill, that's exactly what he would do, especially if it was a young band. You wouldn't have to do much with the David Mattox. He comes in with the sound, and the way he plays it creates the sound. All you got to do is mic it up properly, But some of these new bands like Voyager that we were working with, and Voyager's a good example, the drummer came in with a kit he mainly uses for live, and it was pretty awful. You put a mic on it, poing, it's got boings all over it. So, and Gus he would not take any, he's got to get the sound that he's got to get. So, and in the case of this Voyager thing, I always tell the story is that he spent hours and hours, this guy hitting a drum, hit the drum, that drum's no good, get another drum, bang, bang, bang. So to cut a long story short, by the time Gus said to this guy, right, we've got the sound, we can start, the guy said, well, I'm going to have to go home. Sorry, I can't hit any more drums. And they had to get a new drummer in.
He was drummed out?
Yeah, he was totally drummed out. He thought I'm not going to be able to handle this. I'm not going to be able to, because Gus was a force to deal with, you see. As a musician, he was a force to deal with. And you had to be at the top of your game. It's no good you being like half, you can sort of play in time, or you can kind of do a drum fill, or you can sort of tune your guitar. You've got to be at the top of your game, And even when I was doing backing vocals, sometimes I'd think, I'm going to die. He's making me do it again. He's making me do it again and again and again. And Gus would push you to the limit, to beyond the limits that you thought you could reach, you see.
Were you there when he worked with audience?
No. That was, I guess that was before Elton audience. I only met Elton I only met Gus when he started, he also worked with the Bonzo Dog Doodah band. And I think audience,
That singer, I forget his name. That guy, I think it was David Henschel who told me. He says that guy used to blow mics.
What?
Blow mics. His voice was so
Oh, I
powerful.
see. Yeah. I know the band, of course, and I know Gus worked with audience, but I can't place who the singer was or what era that was. Of course, Gus did other projects, and he was doing other projects when I knew him. But obviously, when he came to the mill, then we would do it. When he built the mill, then I was doing it, all the projects that he was involved in at that time. Yeah, phenomenal producer. But as an engineer, because what used to happen is I'd set the sound up and there'd be nothing to do for another. I mean, I say that the solo on the one I always use as an example is the solo on Nikita that Fred Mandel recorded. The way I explain it is that people were going off and having babies and stuff, and they'd come back and we'd still be doing the solo in. They go, "You're still working on this solo?" But actually, when you hear the solo, it's like a film. It goes on forever, but it's a work of art. I mean, that's the thing with the stuff I did with Gus is no matter what you thought about and wanting to kill yourself when we were doing it, because it used to go on so long, when you heard the results, they were kind of it was worth every effort that was put in, So, but it wasn't easy to work with him as an engineer,
Why did Elton change? Do you know why he because I know Gus came back, obviously, but
yeah, well, Elton sort of changes things and always has done in his career, which is great because otherwise he'd have still been doing Empty Sky, and then they changed direction for the Elton John. So he's always kind of making changes, admittedly maybe not for many years now, probably just his jackets and his suits and his socks and stuff, but he would change. And I mean, there might have been a time when even Elton was fed up with how long Gus would spend, and he might have just thought, I can't face another album, I can't go through it. Because actually what happened before Ice on Fire, Gus wasn't going to do that album, and Steve Brown he said, right, Elton's coming in to do an album. I said, oh great, yeah, because he's going to book loads of time. This is when Jimmy owned the studio. And I said, so who's producing? He says, I don't know. And I said, well, good, keep it at that, because I want to do it. We don't need a producer, you don't need someone else. We'll do it. We'll do it. And it was only about 2 weeks before the actual date, and I'm getting so excited about doing this album. And then Steve calls up. He says, well, I've got some news for you. We have got a producer. It's Gus. And as much as I love Gus, I was like, oh bugger, because Gus no longer owned the mill now. You see, Jimmy Page owned the mill, and I was kind of looking forward to doing it. And that was only the beginning, because Gus had been out of the picture for so long. He decided that this album is going to be the Elton album of all time. It's going to surpass anything that we've done before. And I can tell you, I'm giving you scoop after scoop here. So one of the things they decided for Ice on Fire was that instead of having just 10 songs to record, Elton's going to write 20 songs and pick the best 10. So that was pretty unique, because generally he'd only write the amount of songs needed for the album. So he'd written all these songs, 20 songs or whatever it was, and we start recording. But pretty soon they're talking about they're all great. There's going to be 2 albums, or it's going to be a double album. But the thing with Ice on Fire, Gus had just, as I say, decided this was going to be the ultimate album. So I suppose he approached it a bit like the first Elton album, where there was going to be no expense spared whatsoever. And it's just going to be through the stratosphere as far as productions go. So he booked all these musicians. I was told you, like 4 drummers, 3 bass players, Nick Kershaw on guitar, Davy Johnston on guitar, you know, different musicians for different tracks. And he was really going for it. And so we started doing this. I think the other problem was that what was up with Elton? I think he was bulimic. I think that's what it was. And he was smoking a lot of dope. So, but actually all he was doing was mainly giggling throughout the whole album. All I remember is him giggling, like he was sitting on the settee, giggling away while I'm having rows actually with Gus, because Gus decided that this was going to be the album of all time. So whereas he might only spend 2 hours on a drum solo or drum sound, he'd spend 10 hours, and I could see this album was never going to end. It's going to go on for years. And my son was about to be born, and I'd made this decision that I don't care what's happening at that time. I'm going to be there for the birth, and then I'm going to go off and look after him for a couple of months. And Gus is saying, what are you worried about? You know, we're going to be finished this album in a few weeks. And I'm thinking, no, you're not. You know, so it went on and on and on and on. It went on and on and on, a bit like Nikita, that song on the album, because I didn't hear any hits on it. I didn't hear any hits on the album. You know, there were some good tracks, Ice on Fire. I couldn't hear any hits. And there was this one song, Nikita, that became a huge hit, as we know, but it was just totally boring. Every time we played it, it just would go on and on and on. And then it would go on, and then it would go into another middle eight. I don't know whether you've noticed there's 2 middle eights in it. And it's almost like you think it's finished, then it does it again. You think, oh no, I can't believe it. And it becomes this huge hit. And Nick Kershaw played on that one. The good thing about Ice on Fire was all these great people that came in. George Michael, you know, although he was a bit mad. Nick Kershaw.
What do you mean he was a bit mad?
Well, he was running around everywhere, sort of with all these ideas. And I didn't really even know. Yeah, I knew he was a big artist with Wham, but he wasn't as big as Elton by no means, you know. And he was telling Elton what to do. I mean, who knew whether he was gay or straight or whatever? And I guess Elton must have fancied him a bit. I don't know. There wasn't anything going on with them, but he was coming up with all these ideas, these crazy ideas, and Elton was just going, "Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do that." And I was thinking, why is he doing that? But we also had, like I say, the rhythm section of Queen. Well, we had the drummer. Do we have the bass player? I don't know.
John Deacon.
This is a good example for you. It's funny how all these drum things come up. Who's the drummer with Queen? Sorry, I forgot.
Roger Taylor.
Roger Taylor comes in, right? So Roger Taylor comes in. I don't know what track he played on, but he started out recording with the rest of the band, whoever that was. I don't know who that was. And Gus is having problems with the drums. He's having problems with Roger with the timing. Because actually Roger's much like a Nigel, isn't he? He's not intricate, you know, he's straight.
Yeah. And
in the end, it's no word of a lie. He had Roger in the studio on his own, playing to a click track. And Roger is like, he's in a bit of a state, to be honest, because I don't know if he hadn't been in the studio for a long time, but he wasn't used to being pushed around the way Gus was pushing him around, you know. Like, you got to stick here and you got to do this, and when it gets to this thing, and when it goes to, and you could see Roger, he's like sweating away. He's like, you know, like can't believe he just wished he hadn't said he would do this session, you know.
Oh my God.
He wished he was anywhere else but doing this session, you know. Because Gus he was ruthless, but he was such a great character that he did it in such a nice way you might not even notice.
Well, David Henschel told me on Goodbye Albert Road, I said, well, what about like the sound, the barnyard sounds on some songs? He said, well, they were all organic. We would go out in the field with a microphone, and if we needed a pig, you know, or something.
But the thing with Gus is, you see, he was very organic as well, but he'd make something that was initially organic into the least organic thing by spending forever on it, you know, so that something organic is supposed to happen quickly and supposed to be, you know, put together. I mean, I'm sure Recording a Pig. I don't know where you get that from for Yellow Brick Road.
It was a Texan love song. I forget. There was one song. Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers.
Oh yeah, Roy. The thing is that Yellow Brick Road, the other double album, you know, Blue Moves. I mean, they're epic. The Blue Moves. When I heard that all the way through, and I didn't work on that album at all. That was all. It was just the best thing I'd ever heard in my life. Every track was the best thing I ever heard, sound wise, everything wise.
You're touching on something now, which I find that Blue Moves of all the Elton John albums is the album that same as you. When I heard that album, I went, and I loved Rock of the Westies, but Blue Moves had so many different genres on it, and there was so much going on.
Yeah. So the thing is that if you didn't have, all I had to do was sit and listen to the final thing. If you had to sit there for 6 months, you couldn't listen to it. Obviously, you can't listen to it in the same way. But to be just sat there and you suddenly hear this, like I heard pretty much the Elton album, to be honest, although I knew the songs. The Elton John album is 60 years on and all that. So you don't hear what went in to make it. You only hear the result. And then it's a bit like, actually for me, it was Foreigner 4. Foreigner 4, you know, was one of my favorite albums of all time. I don't care if it took 10 years to make that album. I couldn't give a monkey's. It's a piece of work. It's a piece of work. And any time that was spent on it was totally worthwhile, you see, you know. So I appreciate, you know, all the stuff that Gus did. I mean, we did have some fallings out. Well, because he used to smoke dope, you see, at Gus as well. And he'd blow it all over me. And so, you know, sitting there for 18 hours wasn't much fun anyway. But being bloody stoned when you didn't even have a drag on the thing wasn't easy either. I'm falling asleep. I'm trying to keep my eyes open. And he, with Gus, I can talk about him forever. He's up there on the wall. Hash used to make him more speedy. It has that effect on some people. So the more he smoked, the more he'd be running around the room, you know. I mean, you know, Elton calls him like the captain of the ship. You know, he was, the main thing I learned from Gus in the studio was there's no problems that can't be fixed here. You know, everything is achievable. Certainly it's achievable if you've got the right musicians. Otherwise you've got a problem. But there was nothing that Gus, and there would never be a moment in the, we used to have that with some bands, Hookfoot, I suppose. And there'd always be moments in the studio where everyone's going, well, I don't know. What do you think? Well, I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. There would never be that with Gus, because Gus was always in control, would always know what the next step is. And
you had that with Hookfoot, with Roger and Caleb, and
well, because the thing is that they'd all be stoned, you see, and no one was in charge. So that was actually, to be honest, although I just stuck that in, that was the problem with Hookfoot, that there was no leader and there was no one leading the commercial possibilities of that band. So, you know, they were very much a jazz, funk, rock, you know, but there was no, I mean, Gus's focus on what's commercial and what, and arrangement wise for songs, I try and carry that on. I mean, it, you know, it's all very well having great musicianship, this, that, and the other, but one way or another, you want to sell some records and you want to make them appeal and you want to have them have, you know, a journey and an atmosphere and a passion and everything else that Gus brought to all those. I mean, obviously Elton songs, you know, dictate a lot of that. And you've got to say that the productions that he did with other producers, I can't remember the main guy's name that he worked with from Air. And when you listen to those productions, they're not a million miles different to Gus's in a way. But I just put together a tribute to Gus, actually. If you go on my Facebook, I could send it to you, actually. Someone sent me, American guy sent, if he wrote the tribute, and I put music and it's quite a while ago, but I put music and video to it. It's quite simple. I tell you what, when you listen to some of Elton's things that all Gus did, I mean, it's a journey. I mean, it's a journey that he took Elton on, and Elton took Gus on that journey, and it was very much a team at that time, an amazing team.
Yeah. With Coda, with Zeppelin, what was that atmosphere like? Was like the band was, has it been announced at that point that they were finished?
Okay, so that story, here we go, is that the story is that Gus was given a, Gus isn't with us anymore, I'm sorry, but I can say what I like. But anyway, he was given £1 million tax bill, which he didn't have. He had a bad accountant. You know, he had to sell the mill. So the mill was kind of up for sale. All sorts of, Richard Branson was interested. Lots of people were interested. Gus was trying to do a deal with someone. Anyway, in the end, we heard that, I'll try and, this could be 15 minutes though. Is that, we got
That's
15
okay.
minutes? Right, so we heard, because this is another scoop. So we heard that there's a musician, a rather famous one, who is interested in buying the mill. And he's that famous that he's flying in. His plane's arriving somewhere and he's flying in and he's going to come and see the mill. He's interested. So, but we're not allowed to know who it is. So we're all trying to think, who could it be? I think for some reason, we thought Roger Daltrey, you know, The Who, maybe it's Mick Jagger, maybe it's the Stones. I don't know. One way or another, we were working on an album in the studio. The door opens and in walks, not these two people, but Jimmy Page. And yeah, you know, he looks like Jimmy Page, and he's very quiet. He's very shy. We were in the middle of a rock album. Actually, it was a good time for him to. Shooting Star, the band was called, from Texas, but he just walked in and was looking around, and I don't remember. I only remember him coming into the control room because he must have gone round, but you know, we were working. So anyway, we then hear subsequently he wants to buy it. He's going to buy it. And everything from then on was nothing to do with Jimmy. It was always through his accountant, who was like his manager, or this one or that one. It was never direct at all. I'd never spoken to Jimmy at all. But I got it through the grapevine that he wanted to keep me on. So I thought, well, that's nice because I like it here. You know, so I thought, well, that's nice. And he wanted to keep on the maintenance guy, Rod. So I thought, well, that's nice. So anyway, so this happened. So Gus has left the mill, and Jimmy's now the owner. And I'm thinking, Led Zeppelin. So I better swat up on what Led Zeppelin's all about. I mean, I kind of knew. I wasn't a massive fan. But to be honest, Elton John, when he first got his first stereo system, had this massive system in his house. And we used to put on a Zeppelin, early Zeppelin, and it was like the best thing we'd ever had. Anyway, so I was excited, although I was thinking that the mill wasn't really set up for Zeppelin, like for the drum sound, a very dry, very dry 80s sound that we were getting in there. So I was thinking up how we're going to get the John Bonham drum sound. Anyway, I didn't have to worry because what happened was they were about to go on tour. They were about to do a European tour, and they were rehearsing at Bray Studios. So I used to turn up at Bray Studios because I want to meet my new boss. I'd only met him for 5 minutes, and now I work for the guy. I think I ought to meet him. So they're rehearsing at Bray. Every time I turned up, they'd either not got there yet or they just left. So I'd sort of hang around. I probably should have hung around longer, but then I'd go home. Anyway, then it's all over the news. John Bonham was staying at Jimmy's house. Terrible thing. He died. You know, he'd overdone it or done something or other. Terrible, terrible thing. So that put off even longer that I was likely to meet Jimmy, because now he's in mourning and God knows what's going on. And of course, the whole Zeppelin thing is now big question mark. So I suppose what we did think was that they're bound to replace him with someone. And I thought Simon Kirke. I think a few people thought Simon Kirke from Bad Company, who I did work with. I'm not sure then, but I worked with subsequently. We haven't spoken about him. Absolutely brilliant drummer, great guy. You know, I've been very fortunate to work with some great drummers. But anyway, so that wasn't going to happen. So actually, the first thing that happened was Jimmy said that, I don't know, or someone said that there's some tapes arriving, some Zeppelin tapes are going to arrive. So these multi-tracks started arriving, and I was putting them in the tape store. And then at some point he came in, I guess, and said, we're doing a tribute album. We're doing a tribute to John Bonham, actually, is what he said. You know, I don't suppose they had the title of the album. And he'd actually, you know, we're going to be working together. Well, I thought, well, that was good, because actually I've been working for him for about 3 months. I didn't met him, you know. So he brings in this tape that I put on the multi-track, and talk about being chucked in at the deep end. It's all drums, you know, and it's all drums. And it's this Bonzo's Montreux, which is a crazy track by any stretch of the imagination. It's crazy. And I'm thinking, oh, it would have been nice if we'd just had something simple while I'm working with Jimmy for the first time, you know. And I always say it was definitely like being thrown in at the deep end. So anyway, I did the best I could. Also, Jimmy is still with us, but maybe he's not listening. He was out of his tree most of the time. I mean, it's difficult sometimes with Jimmy to know whether it was his eccentricity or the fact that he was out of it on something. Somehow the two went together, and he was quite difficult to understand. And because I thought, this is Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin's producer. He will tell me what to do, right? He will tell me how to get the John Bonham drum sound. He would tell me what reverbs. Well, he didn't tell me anything. And I just sort of went for what I sort of thought. And I figured, well, if he didn't like it, he'd say something. And that's actually how I always work with Jimmy. He didn't tell me what to do. I just get on with it. And then, you know, now and again, he might say something. But he was extremely easy to work with, really. The main problem was waiting for him to arrive, to be honest, with Jimmy. He'd say, right, we're starting at 2 p.m, and he might arrive at midnight. He'd arrive just when I thought, that's it, I'm going home. I've been here 10 hours now, he's not here. As I'd be going to leave, he arrives. And now we're there all night, you know. So that was the only thing with Jimmy. And of course, somehow we got through that album, and you know, again, I got to mix 2 tracks that were from one of my favorite albums of all time, which is In Through the Outdoor. I mean, I love that. That was the main album I got into with Led Zeppelin, to be honest. And there were 2 tracks, Wearing and Tearing and something else, that was from the album. I got to mix them, and I absolutely loved it.
I love that album too. I love that album.
Robert Plant came in, and he was great. He was great to work with. He was a great guy. And anyway, when Jimmy took over the mill, he brought some equipment in. He's always been, I could talk about Jimmy for years, really, but he was very into technical stuff. And he's always into advancement in technique, and into the, you know, whatever was the latest thing. But the best project was probably, we did the music to Death Wish 2.
Project. What was he like on that project?
We're still out of it, but he was still out of it. But he brought in this. Jimmy got hold of these Roland guitar synths, you know, and he does all this crazy stuff on there. And he started using the bow. He used the theremin. I thought the theremin was like a little animal of some sort. Someone said, "Bring out the theremin." I thought they were taking the piss. I thought it was like a little hamster or something. What the hell is a theremin? And so, to be honest, genius producer, without really even telling me what to do. He was a genius producer. And when it came to solos, he'd do like 3 tracks, and then he'd put the 3 guitars up there, and he'd make up a solo. He'd say, right, 2 bits from there, 1 bit from. I mean, he was difficult to understand, but I guess we got there in the end.
Very much.
And I you know, genius producer, because he couldn't necessarily always play what he wanted to play, but it was in his head is where the genius was, and how he puts things together. And that is, it's funny actually, because when I read that Jimmy Page is the best guitarist that's ever lived, I shouldn't say this, but I should say we ought to have worked with him.
Hope you enjoyed that. Love talking to Stuart. I could talk to him for ages, and chances are we'll talk to him again about Mostly Jimmy Page, really. I wanted to get a lot more from him concerning Jimmy Page. That'll come up in the next little while. I'm John Beaudin. This is Rock History Book. Take care.